popped the hood on two iShares global equity ETFs that invested in developed markets only. Next up, two iShares global equity ETFs that include both developed and emerging market stocks. BlackRock released the iShares MSCI ACWI ETF in 2008 to track the MSCI ACWI Index. ACWI is just an acronym for All Country World Index. It includes all the developed companies in the MSCI World Index, plus all the large and mid-cap companies included in the MSCI Emerging Markets Index. The MSCI ACWI Index allocates about 12% to emerging markets companies, reducing its developed stock market exposure to around 88% relative to the MSCI World Index, which invests only in developed markets. There is another way to gain the same exposure to the MSCI ACWI Index. You could invest 88% of your portfolio in the iShares MSCI World ETF, Earth, and the remaining 12% in the iShares MSCI Emerging Markets ETF, EEM. We've covered both of these funds in past videos. However, for the added complication, you'd only save about 0.03% per year in product costs. Since ACWI is a US-listed ETF, it also avoids the 15% US withholding tax on foreign dividends when held in a tax-deferred account such as an RSP, LIRA, RIF, or LIF. I've included ACWI's estimated foreign withholding tax impact across various account types in a chart near the end of this video. Our next fund, the iShares Core MSCI All Country World ex-Canada Index ETF, XAW, is a favorite among Canadian investors seeking global stock market exposure. You may have already noticed we've included XAW in both the Canadian Couch Potato and the Canadian Portfolio Manager model ETF portfolios. XAW trades on the Canadian stock market and tracks the performance of the MSCI ACWI ex-Canada IMI Index, which allocates about 56% to US equities, 32% to international equities, and about 12% to emerging markets equities. This index is similar to the MSCI ACWI Index with two notable differences. 1. The ex-Canada in the name indicates that Canadian stocks are excluded from the index, so XAW excludes Canadian companies while ACWI includes them. This exclusion is a nice feature for Canadian investors who may already have an extreme home bias. 2. The IMI in the name, which happens to stand for Investable Market Index, indicates that the index tracks large, mid, and small cap stocks, while ACWI tracks just large and mid cap stocks. So XAW includes small cap stocks, while ACWI does not. XAW uses a fund of funds or wrap structure to gain exposure to the index's asset classes, but with some interesting nuances. First, for US equity exposure, iShares picked not just one, but four of its existing US-listed ETFs, IVV, IJH, IJR, and ITOT. Since none of their existing ETFs precisely track the MSCI USA IMI Index, the interesting combination is iShares' attempt to mimic the index's specific returns anyway. In addition, iShares claims their proprietary Aladdin equity risk model possesses special powers to minimize tracking error between the combined performance of the four ETFs and the MSCI USA IMI Index. The verdict's out on whether this is just wishful thinking or if they should have just simply held ITOT. The argument against holding only ITOT is that it follows the S&P Total Market Index, which includes a tiny allocation to microcap stocks, while the MSCI USA IMI Index only includes large, mid, and small cap stocks. Practically speaking, the returns of both indices have been nearly identical over the past 10 years, so investors would have likely been comfortable if XAW had held just ITOT from the onset. For international equity exposure, iShares has opted to hold the iShares Core MSCI EFI IMI Index ETF, XEF. As the ETF is Canadian listed and holds the underlying international stocks directly, this choice has resulted in greater tax efficiency across all account types, relative to holding its US-listed counterpart, the iShares Core MSCI EFI ETF, IEFA. Holding IEFA would have resulted in an additional layer of unrecoverable foreign withholding taxes, mostly due to XAW's wrap structure. For emerging markets exposure, the most tax-efficient fund would have been a Canadian-listed ETF that holds the underlying emerging market stocks directly. This would have mitigated the cost drag from foreign withholding taxes. Too bad there are currently no Canadian-listed ETFs available that follow the MSCI Emerging Markets IMI Index and hold the underlying stocks directly. To make do, iShares chose to hold the US-listed iShares Core MSCI Emerging Markets ETF, IEMG. Although ACWI and XAW are imperfect substitutes for one another, I've compared their foreign withholding tax drag across various accounts in this chart. XAW is expected to be more tax efficient than ACWI across all accounts except tax-deferred accounts, such as RSPs, LIRAs, RIFs, and LIFs. From a product cost standpoint, holding XAW, instead of purchasing all of its underlying ETF holdings, will cost you about 0.22%, or roughly twice the weighted average cost of the underlying ETFs. However, most investors with modest-sized portfolios and limited time to spend managing them would likely agree. The simplicity of XAW seems worth the additional cost. If you're an investor with relatively large RSPs or other tax-deferred accounts, you may want to consider replacing XAW with 3 US-listed ETFs to reduce your product costs and foreign withholding tax drag. For your larger tax-deferred accounts, I suggest a mix of ITOT, IEFA, and IMG in my CPM model ETF portfolios, instead of XAW. I estimate the switch-out could produce around 0.39% in annual cost and tax savings. On a $10,000 global equity allocation, you'd only save around $39. So investors with smaller portfolios may be better off just holding XAW. But on a $100,000 allocation, estimated annual savings increase to $390. That's probably money worth keeping in your pocket by breaking up your XAW allocation. As purchasing US-listed ETFs requires US dollars, please refer to my Norbert's Gambit video tutorials, which will show you how to cost-effectively convert your Canadian dollars to US dollars at various Canadian discount brokerages. If you're also interested in comparing the MER and foreign withholding tax differences between various broad market ETFs, please try out my foreign withholding tax calculator, available as a free download on the Canadian Portfolio Manager blog. Next up, in part 3 of our Under the Hood Global Equity ETF series, we'll check out 2 global equity ETFs from Vanguard.